The scent of decaying paper and binding glue was Elias Vance's sanctuary. It was the smell of history, of tangible truth, a fragrant bulwark against the uncatalogued chaos of the present. As head archivist for the city's historical society, his life was a meticulously curated affair. He spent his days in the hushed, climate-controlled silence of the repository, surrounded by the ghosts of lives lived, their triumphs and tragedies pressed between the pages of brittle, yellowed letters and captured in the silver nitrate of faded photographs. His specialty was provenance, the unbroken chain of custody that proved a document's authenticity. He dealt in primary sources, in the unvarnished stories that resisted the erosion of time and revisionism. His own life felt similarly ordered, a quiet rebellion against the entropy of the world outside. For 20 years, since the day his wife Lena had placed their newborn daughter in his arms, and then, in a cascade of clinical emergencies and hushed apologies, slipped away from him forever, his existence had been curated around a single, luminous truth. Zoe, at 54, Elias was a man etched by quiet habits, his movements possessing the same gentle precision he used to handle a 19th century manuscript. He rose at 5:30 each morning, the pre-dawn quiet a canvas for his thoughts. The house was still, holding its breath before the city awoke. He prepared his Earl Grey tea in a specific porcelain pot, a wedding gift from Lena's aunt, letting it steep for exactly 4 minutes while he stood at the kitchen window, overlooking the small walled garden he meticulously tended. It was Lena's garden, really. He was just its custodian. He moved through his brownstone as if it were a living exhibit, each object possessed of its own provenance, its own story. The house itself was an archive of their life together, his and Zoe's, with Lena as the presiding spirit, a benevolent ghost whose presence was felt in every room. On the mantelpiece, a photograph of Lena, her expression caught in an impossible balance between mischievous and melancholic, a painter's soul evident in her restless gaze. She had been the vibrant, chaotic color in his monochrome life, the splash of cadmium red on his muted gray canvas. Beside her portrait stood a chronological succession of framed photographs of Zoe, a visual timeline of his life's true work. Zoe as a gap-toothed child with scraped knees, beaming proudly beside a lopsided sandcastle on a windy day at the coast, the salty air whipping her hair across her face. He could still feel the grit of the sand in his shoes, the warmth of her small hand in his. Zoe at 10, looking utterly mortified in a bright pink bridesmaid's dress at his cousin's wedding, her scowl a stark contrast to the frilly confection she was forced to wear. He remembered her hiding under a table later, and him joining her, sharing a stolen piece of wedding cake on a napkin. Zoe at 16, her face a study in adolescent angst, black eyeliner, and a defiant stare that couldn't quite conceal the softness he knew was there, a softness she saved for late-night talks in the kitchen over ice cream. And the most recent one, Zoe at 20, an art student at the university. Her smile a brighter, clearer echo of her mother's, her eyes filled with the future he was determined to protect. Zoe was the masterpiece Lena had left behind. Every overtime hour he'd ever worked, every social engagement politely declined, every personal ambition quietly shelved, was a brushstroke in the portrait of his devotion. His love for Zoe was his magnum opus, the foundational document of his identity, the one piece of history he thought he knew completely. He was in his study, a room lined floor to ceiling with books on history, conservation, and cartography. The air smelled of leather and old wood, a scent that always calmed him. He was painstakingly restoring the binding of a Civil War-era diary, its author a young Union soldier from Ohio named Corporal John Miller, who wrote with heartbreaking clarity of homesickness and the terror of the battlefield. Elias felt a kinship with these voices from the past. They spoke with an honesty that felt rare in the modern world. He was using a bone folder to smooth a patch of Japanese paper over a tear in the cover, his movements slow and deliberate. The mud is a constant companion, Miller had written. It claims our boots, our blankets, our spirits. I dream of my mother's kitchen, of the smell of baking bread, and I wake to the smell of gunpowder and fear. Elias was applying a thin layer of archival paste to the frayed spine when his phone vibrated against the polished oak of his desk. The sharp buzzing sound was an intrusion, a digital anomaly in his analog world, a harsh tear in the fabric of his concentration. He sighed, annoyed at the interruption. It was probably a notification from the library system, but the display showed the university hospital's main line. A familiar knot of parental anxiety, a feeling he'd lived with for 2 decades, tightened in his chest. It was an old, cold friend, that fear. It visited him whenever Zoe was 5 minutes late, whenever she had a cough, whenever she took a trip with friends. But a call from the hospital itself was different. This was the fear stepping out of the shadows. Zoe was a student there, yes, but she was an art student. She was supposed to be in a life drawing class in the Fine Arts Building, a place of charcoal dust and quiet concentration, not a place that necessitated a call from the medical center. Is this Elias Vance? The voice was female, preternaturally calm, but with an undercurrent of practiced urgency that made the fine hairs on his arms stand up. It was the voice of someone who delivered bad news for a living, a voice stripped of inflection to prevent it from cracking. This is he. His own voice was steady, a reflex of his professional demeanor, the archivist asserting control over the panicked father. Mr. Vance, this is Dr. A. Ruddy Sharma from the University Medical Center. I'm calling about your daughter, Zoe Vance. There has been an accident on campus. You should come to the emergency department as soon as you can. The world, once so ordered, so meticulously cross-referenced, fractured into a million sharp-edged pieces. The bone folder clattered onto the desk. The diary slipped from his grasp. It hit the hardwood floor with a sickening crack. Its fragile spine, the very thing he had been trying to save, breaking clean in two. The sound seemed to reverberate through his own bones, a symbolic snapping of his own carefully constructed reality. Accident, hospital, Zoe. The words were a brutalist architecture, stark, unadorned, and unforgiving. He was on his feet without remembering the decision to stand. The scent of archival paste was suddenly cloying, the smell of pointless preservation. The words of the long-dead Corporal Miller echoed in his head. The smell of gunpowder and fear. The drive was a fugue state. He navigated the familiar city streets as if he were a ghost. The world outside a smear of color and noise. Red lights and blaring horns seemed to belong to another dimension, one in which time still moved in a linear fashion. His mind, usually a bastion of logic and sequence, had become a frantic, chaotic loop of a single, desperate prayer, a bargain offered to a universe he had always viewed with academic detachment. Let her be whole. Let her be safe. Take anything else. Take my years. Take my house. Take everything. Just let her be. He flashed back to a memory of Zoe at 6, falling from her new two-wheeler, her small face streaked with tears and blood from a scraped chin. He remembered the fierce protective terror of that moment, how he had scooped her up, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs, her small body trembling against his. It's okay. Daddy's here, he'd whispered, rocking her, his own fear a metallic taste in his mouth. This was that feeling magnified 1,000 times, a terror so vast it had no edges, a black ocean threatening to drown him. He ran a red light without noticing, earning a long, angry blast from a taxi's horn that barely registered. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, his careful archivist's hands locked in a death grip. The emergency room was a cacophony of controlled panic, a brightly lit stage for human misery. The air was thick with the smells of antiseptic, fear, and something metallic he didn't want to identify. Phones rang, monitors beeped in a discordant symphony of crisis, and a child was wailing somewhere nearby, a sound that pierced straight through him. Elias stood, lost and useless, near the triage desk, his tweed jacket and leather satchel marking him as an outsider in this realm of scrubs and gurneys. He felt like a man from another century, a historical artifact misplaced in the frantic present. A nurse with a tired face asked if she could help him, but the words wouldn't come. He just stared, his mind blank with shock. Dr. Sharma found him there. She was a petite woman with weary, intelligent eyes, and a professional calm that felt like an anchor in the storm of his fear. She placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Mr. Vance," she said softly. He could only nod. She led him away from the chaos of the main floor, down a sterile corridor to a small windowless room designated for family consultations, a name that was in itself a harbinger of dread. The room contained 2 chairs and a small table with a box of tissues. It was a room designed for the delivery of life-altering news. Her words were direct, stripped of the false comfort he knew he didn't want. He was an archivist. He dealt in facts, however harsh. A scaffolding collapse at the Fine Arts Building, which was undergoing facade restoration. A freak accident, high winds, a structural failure, a cascade of steel pipes and wooden planks. Zoe had been walking back from the campus coffee shop, her headphones on, passing underneath. She wouldn't have heard a thing. The injuries were severe, catastrophic. Her tone was clinical, but her eyes were full of a deep human pity. Internal bleeding, multiple comminuted fractures to her pelvis and legs, and a severe cranial trauma. She was in the surgical ICU, alive, but only just. The word alive was a tiny flickering candle in a hurricane, a word he clung to with the last of his strength. "We're fighting a war on multiple fronts, Mr. Vance," she explained, her voice low and even, forcing him to focus. "We have a team of orthopedic and vascular surgeons working to stabilize the fractures and address the internal hemorrhaging. But the primary challenge right now, the one that is threatening her life, minute by minute, is the massive blood loss. We've been transfusing, but she's hemorrhaging faster than we can replace it. Her body is in a state of profound shock. And in the process, we've encountered a profound, almost unprecedented complication." Elias felt the cold dread in his gut coalesce into a physical weight, a block of ice. "Complication?" The word was a whisper, a dry rustle of sound. "Your daughter's blood is extraordinary, genetically speaking." Dr. Sharma chose her words with the precision of a surgeon. "She's R null. It's a phenotype so rare it's often called golden blood. It lacks all 61 antigens in the Rh system." To put that in perspective, most people have a positive or negative designation based on the presence or absence of one antigen, the D antigen. She is missing all of them. For context, less than 50 people in the entire world are confirmed to have it. On top of that, her sample shows a private antigen variant, K-mod, which is another rare marker that further complicates things. It narrows the pool of potential donors from infinitesimal to functionally non-existent. Our blood bank, the city's central bank, the National Registry, they have nothing. We can't give her standard O-negative blood, which is the universal donor in most cases. Her immune system would see it as a foreign invader and launch a catastrophic attack. Her body would reject it violently. We're synthesizing what we can, volume expanders and oxygen carriers, but it's not true blood. It's not enough to carry sufficient oxygen to her organs. Without a direct compatible donor, her organs will begin to fail from lack of oxygen. She won't survive the next few hours. The doctor's words were a death sentence delivered in calm, clinical prose. One in billions. A genetic ghost. A beautiful fatal flaw. He saw Zoe's face, her vibrant smile, her eyes full of life, and the image was already starting to feel like a photograph in his archive, a relic of a time that was past. No, he refused to accept it. His mind, trained to find connections and forgotten facts, scrambled through the disordered files of his own life, searching desperately for a misplaced document, a forgotten entry. A memory surfaced, hazy and distant, from more than a decade ago. A routine physical for a new life insurance policy he'd taken out for Zoe's future. The doctor, an older man named Peterson with a bushy mustache, had been reviewing his lab work. He'd made an offhand comment, peering at the sheet over his spectacles. "You have very unusual blood, Mr. Vance. Nothing to worry about, just a rare marker combination. You're one of a kind." Elias had dismissed it at the time, a piece of trivia about himself that had no practical application. It was an uncatalogued fact, an anomaly he had filed away and forgotten. Until now. "Me?" Elias croaked, the word tearing from his throat. He grabbed Dr. Sharma's sleeve, his archivist's gentle precision gone, replaced by a frantic, desperate grip. His fingers dug into the fabric of her white coat. "Test me. My blood. It's rare. A doctor told me years ago. I don't know the details, the names you used, but he told me it was rare. It has to be me. It has to be from me." A flicker of professional doubt, mixed with compassion, crossed her features. She was a doctor accustomed to the desperate bargaining of grieving relatives, to the magical thinking that blooms in the face of tragedy. Families often offered impossible solutions born of love and denial. But the sheer force of his plea, the raw certainty in his eyes, was undeniable. This wasn't just hope, it was conviction. "Of course, Mr. Vance. We'll run a stat panel immediately. The lab is this way. We can have preliminary results in under an hour." Hope, fragile and terrifying, bloomed in the wasteland of his fear. It was a narrative too perfect, too symmetrical to be real, a miracle worthy of the hagiographies he sometimes studied. The father, the sole parent, the man who had dedicated his life to his daughter, now possessed of the one key that could unlock her survival. He would literally pour his life into her, replenishing what the world had tried to steal. It was the ultimate expression of his love, the final definitive validation of the life he had built around her. He sat in a small, cold phlebotomy chair, watching his own dark red blood fill a series of vials, the liquid a shade darker than the binding of a treasured first edition. He prayed with an intensity that frightened him, a primal appeal to a cosmos he had only ever observed, cataloged, and analyzed. He prayed to Lena, to whatever force governed the universe, to the God of fathers and daughters. An hour passed like a decade. He sat in the desolate quiet of the surgical waiting area, a room painted in a shade of beige designed to be soothing, but that only felt like despair. He stared at a bland, generic seascape on the wall, the waves frozen in a perpetual, placid state that mocked the turmoil inside him. Every beat from the hallway, every footstep made him jump. He tried to read a magazine, but the words were just black marks on a page. His world had shrunk to this single point, this one question. Finally, Dr. Sharma returned, her footsteps silent on the linoleum. The look on her face was not one of relief. It was not the look of a bearer of good news. It was one of deep, profound confusion. The anchor of her calm had slipped, and she looked at him as if he were a scientific anomaly himself, a paradox she couldn't resolve. "Mr. Vance," she began, her voice strained, losing its professional armor. "We have the preliminary results from the lab." Am I a match? He asked, his entire being coiled into that one question. The world seemed to hold its breath. The bland seascape on the wall seemed to ripple. No, she said softly, the word a gentle execution. You are not. You are O negative, which is indeed rare, but you have a standard RH profile. You are not RH null. Your blood has common RH antigens that Zoe's lacks. Donating to her would trigger a massive hemolytic reaction. It would be fatal for her. The fragile hope shattered into dust, plunging him back into the abyss, deeper this time. It was over. The miracle had been a mirage. He slumped in his chair, the sterile air of the hospital seeming to thin, to suffocate him. The seascape on the wall seemed to mock him with its endless, indifferent blue. A mistake. Dr. Peterson had been wrong, or Elias had misremembered. A simple, fatal error. But that's not... Dr. Sharma hesitated, pulling a tablet from under her arm and swiping through a series of complex charts and graphs that looked like an alien language. That's not the part that's confusing us. As part of the emergency protocol, given the extreme rarity of her blood, we ran a full genomic sequence from her sample. It's a new rapid response technique. We do this to try and identify genetic relatives in national and international donor databases who might share the same rare markers. It's a Hail Mary, but we had to try. We used your sample for a baseline comparison, assuming a direct parent-child genetic link. Elias stared at her, not comprehending. The technical jargon was a smokescreen, a wall of words he couldn't penetrate. He just shook his head, lost in the fog of his grief and confusion. I don't understand. What does that mean? Dr. Sharma took a deep breath, her gaze meeting his with an expression of immense, unwilling pity. This was a different kind of bad news, one she was clearly not trained to deliver, a violation of a trust she hadn't known existed. Mr. Vance, the fundamentals of genetics are straightforward in this regard. A child inherits half of their genetic markers from their mother and half from their father. They also inherit their mitochondrial DNA, the energy factories of the cells, exclusively from their mother. We cross-referenced Zoe's mitochondrial DNA with a sample from an old pathology report of your wife's from the time of her death 20 years ago. It's a perfect match. Lena Vance was unequivocally her biological mother. She paused, and the silence in the room became a roaring vacuum, sucking all the air from his lungs. Elias could hear the frantic beating of his own heart, a panicked bird trapped in his ribs. He knew what was coming. He could see it in her eyes. But the paternal markers, the Y chromosome haplotypes, the single nucleotide polymorphisms, the autosomal DNA. Mr. Vance, there is no shared genetic material between you and Zoe. None. Not the 50% you would expect from a father. Not the 25% you would expect from a grandfather or an uncle. Statistically, you are no more related to her than any random person on the street. The probability of you being her biological father is 0. I am so sorry, but scientifically, it is an absolute impossibility. The words were alien artifacts, devoid of meaning, impossible to integrate into any known framework of his life. 0 probability, impossibility, not her father. He heard a sound and realized with a jolt of horror that it was a laugh, a dry, hollow, rattling sound escaping his own throat, a laugh of pure, unadulterated shock. That's absurd, he managed, his voice sounding distant and foreign. There's been a mistake. Your machines are wrong. Your data is corrupted. I was there. I was in the room. I cut the umbilical cord. I held her moments after she was born. My wife, Lena, she died in that hospital. There was no one else. There was never anyone else. His voice cracked on the last words, a fissure appearing in the foundation of his certainty. He could see the delivery room, the bright lights, Lena's exhausted, radiant face. He could feel the impossible weight of newborn Zoe in his arms. It was the most real moment of his life. "We've calibrated the sequencers twice," Dr. Sharma said gently, her voice filled with a terrible, unshakable certainty. "We ran the comparison again. The science is absolute. The results are unambiguous. I cannot explain the circumstances of her birth, Mr. Vance. I can only tell you what the genetics show. I can only tell you the truth as the data presents it. You are not her biological father." The doctor continued to speak, her words turning to a meaningless drone. "She offered counseling, support services, a hospital chaplain." But her voice faded into the background hum of the hospital. The meticulously cataloged archive of his life had been set ablaze. Every memory, every cherished moment was now suspect, coated in a thick, greasy layer of deceit. Zoe's first word, a clear, happy dada, aimed directly at him. The way she had inherited his supposed love for rainy afternoons and Earl Grey tea. The shared jokes, the comfortable silences, the 20 years of unwavering, bone-deep certainty that she was a part of him, an extension of his own being. It was all a fiction, a beautifully crafted, elaborate lie. He had been the curator of a history that was not his own, the caretaker of a story in which he was only a minor character, a footnote. He stumbled from the consultation room, a ghost in the brightly lit, indifferent corridors. He found his way to the surgical ICU, a place of hushed tones and constant electronic surveillance. Through the large glass window of her room, he could see her. Zoe, so pale and still, a fragile doll tangled in a terrifying web of tubes and wires that tethered her to a bank of blinking, beeping machines. The face he knew better than his own, but as he looked at the curve of her jaw, the shape of her nose, the line of her brow, he forced himself to see them for the first time, not as a father, but as a stranger, as an archivist examining a forgery. He searched for a trace of himself and found nothing. He saw only Lena and a phantom, a stranger whose features were now superimposed over his daughter's, a ghost at the feast of his love. The pain of that realization was a physical blow, a shard of glass working its way into his heart. It was a new and terrible kind of grief, sharper and more cruel than the loss of Lena, because it poisoned her memory. It recast his beloved, tragic wife not as a victim of fate, but as the author of a deception that had defined his entire adult life. And he, Elias Vance, the man of facts and primary sources, was the story's unsuspecting fool. The days that followed were a blur of suspended time, a purgatory of vinyl chairs and bad coffee. Zoe remained in a medically induced coma, her condition a terrifyingly fragile stalemate. The machines breathed for her life measured in the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest and the jagged lines on the monitors. The international search for a donor continued, a desperate silent race against the clock, a global plea for golden blood that went unanswered. Elias lived at the hospital, sleeping in uncomfortable chairs in the waiting room, fueled by bitter coffee from the cafeteria and a gnawing emptiness that had taken root deep inside him. The love for Zoe was still there, a fierce protective ache that was primal and undeniable, but it was now tangled with the poison of the truth. Who was he to her? A guardian? A custodian? A long-term foster parent? The lie had hollowed him out, leaving him with a role he no longer understood, a script he had never known he was reading. He couldn't confront his memories of Lena. They were a minefield. Each happy moment now, a potential deception. The memory of their wedding day, her hand in his, her vows of eternal love and trust, now felt like a well-rehearsed performance. He saw her smile not as joy, but as relief, her tears not as emotion, but as guilt. Instead, his archivist's mind, desperate for a foothold of truth in the wreckage, turned to the only primary source he had left: her work. Lena had been a painter, her career just beginning to ignite with a furious, brilliant energy when she died. Her studio, on the top floor of their brownstone, had been sealed for 20 years, a shrine he could never bring himself to disturb, and which Zoe had been too young to remember. Now, it was a crime scene. One evening, unable to bear the sterile air of the hospital any longer, he drove home. The house felt alien, the silence accusatory. Every photograph of Zoe seemed to mock him. With a sense of trespass that felt like a betrayal of his own grief, he climbed the stairs to the top floor, his footsteps echoing in the empty house. The door to her studio was locked. He had kept the key on a separate ring, a relic he never touched, part of a small box of her personal effects. His hand trembled as he inserted it into the lock. The brass was cold. The door groaned open, breaking a seal of dust and memory that had been undisturbed for 2 decades. The air that rushed out was thick and heavy, the ghost of her life. The sharp, clean scent of dried linseed oil and turpentine mingled with the fainter, earthier smell of clay and gesso. Canvases shrouded in white cloths stood like a congregation of ghosts in the slanted light from the large dormer window. He moved into the room and began to unveil them, one by one, pulling away the dusty shrouds with a strange reverence. He had always seen these last paintings as vibrant, passionate explorations of light and shadow, celebrations of her impending motherhood. But now he looked with new eyes, the cold analytical eyes of a detective searching for clues. He saw a recurring darkness, a tension in the frantic, layered brushstrokes, an energy that bordered on despair. A series of self-portraits showed her face half in shadow, her expression unreadable, her eyes looking past the viewer at something he couldn't see. A large canvas depicted a beautiful, serene landscape of rolling hills under a summer sky, but a storm was gathering on the horizon, its clouds a bruised purple and violent gray, a single bolt of lightning cracking the placid scene. It was the art of a woman holding a terrible secret, a woman at war with herself. In the corner, stacked neatly against the wall, were her sketchbooks and journals, bound in worn leather, filled with her thoughts, her fears, her inspirations. He had never read them. They were her private space, her internal archive, and he had respected that boundary with a fierce devotion, even in death. Now, he had no choice. The truth, however painful, was the only thing that could cauterize his wound. He sat on a paint-spattered stool, the dust motes dancing in the single beam of light from the window, and opened the first one from that final year. Her elegant looping script filled the pages, a torrent of thoughts and ideas, sketches of faces and hands interspersed with prose. He flipped through pages detailing her deep, genuine love for him, her excitement and terror about becoming a mother. The words were a comfort and a torture. Then he found it. The entries from the autumn before their wedding, 21 years ago. She wrote of feeling lost, of a sudden suffocating fear of the quiet, stable future he represented. She, who thrived on chaos and impulse, felt she was disappearing into the gentle certainty of his love. Elias is a safe harbor, she wrote, the ink slightly blurred as if by a tear. He is the kindest, most decent man I have ever known. His love is a warm, steady light, but I am a storm. I feel it inside me. I am rattling the windows of my own life, wanting to break the glass just to feel the wind. I feel like an actress in a play about my own life. And soon the curtain will fall, and this will be it. A beautiful, quiet life. Is that enough? Or is it a beautiful, quiet cage? He kept reading, his breath held tight in his chest, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. He turned the page. She wrote of attending a fundraising gala for the museum, an event Elias had skipped due to a looming deadline at work. He remembered that night. He had been restoring a series of fire-damaged municipal ledgers, a project that had consumed him. He'd told her to go, to have fun. He remembered her coming home late, flushed and beautiful, saying she'd had a wonderful time. She wrote of a man she met that night. She never named him, referring to him only as the collector, a patron of the arts, wealthy, powerful, magnetic and married, a man who saw the storm in her and wasn't afraid of the wreckage. He doesn't want to calm me, she wrote, her script becoming more rushed, more frantic. He wants to own the hurricane. We talked for hours, not about the weather or pleasantries, but about art, about ambition, about the beautiful, terrible hunger for more that gnaws at you. He understood the darkness in my work. He said it was the most honest thing about me. He looked at me not as a future wife and mother, but as a force. Being with him felt like a betrayal of Elias, but in that moment, it also felt like a betrayal of myself not to explore it. It was one night, a single, stupid, seismic night in his hotel suite overlooking the park, a fever dream of champagne and dangerous ideas. I woke up in the morning sunlight, alone, with a note on the pillow that just said, "Brava." I felt cheap and exhilarated and broken. I knew I had broken everything, including myself. Elias felt the air leave his lungs in a ragged gasp. The hotel, the park, a single night. The abstract betrayal now had a scene, a setting, a script. He turned the page, his fingers clumsy. A few weeks later, the entries became more frantic, filled with panicked calculations and crossed out dates. She was pregnant, and she didn't know whose child it was. It could be Elias's. It must be. The timing is possible, a fragile possibility I am clinging to with all my strength. We were trying. But what if it's not? What if this little life inside me is the ghost of my mistake, a permanent reminder of my weakness? I love Elias. I love the life we can build. He is my home. I will not, cannot lose him over this. This child will be his, our child. I will be the wife he deserves, the mother this baby deserves, and I will spend my life making this right. I will bury the collector. I will bury this night. My secret will be my penance, the price I pay for a happiness I don't deserve. It is my final, most desperate work of art, a perfect life built on a perfect lie. He closed the journal, his hand shaking so violently he could barely hold it. The confession wasn't from a third party. It was from her own words, a voice from the grave, confirming his obsolescence, his role as a footnote in his own life. He wasn't just a substitute. He was the cover story, the frame for a picture that wasn't his. His entire marriage, the foundation of his fatherhood, had been a desperate, terrified act of concealment. The grief he felt was immense, but beneath it, a new feeling began to crystallize, a cold, hard rage. But the archivist in him, the relentless seeker of fact, wasn't satisfied with just the story. A ghost had to have a name. The collector. It was his only clue, a single thread to pull in the tangled mess of the past. He went back to the hospital, his mind no longer a swirl of grief but a cold, whirring engine of purpose. He needed help. He needed a guide into Lena's world, a world he had only ever observed from the outside. He called Julian Croft, the owner of the prestigious gallery that had represented Lena 2 decades ago. Julian was a man who trafficked in the secrets and scandals of the art world as much as in the art itself, a historian of a different, more volatile sort. They met in the hospital cafeteria, a place devoid of charm or comfort, The smell of disinfectant and stale coffee was a sharp counterpoint to the conversation they were about to have. Elias, looking haggard and broken, his clothes rumpled from days of sleeping in a chair, laid out the barest facts. Zoe was dying. She needed a donor with impossibly rare blood. He wasn't her father. There was another man, a wealthy collector, a patron from 21 years ago. He didn't show Julian the journal. He held that evidence close, his primary source. Julian, a man whose normally flamboyant demeanor was now subdued by the gravity of the situation, listened without interruption. He was older now, his hair a shock of white, but his eyes were still sharp. He stirred his black coffee, his eyes distant, searching the archives of his own memory. Lena, she was on fire that last year, he said softly, his voice raspy. Her work had this dangerous edge to it, a raw power. There were a lot of people buzzing around her, wanting a piece of that fire. She was the talk of the town, but a major collector, a patron who was getting that close, who she called the collector. He paused, his brow furrowed in thought, tapping a long finger against his cup. That narrows it. There was one man. He was obsessed with her work, bought her entire graduate show in one fell swoop, an unprecedented move. He was new money, tech, but trying to buy his way into old world legitimacy through art. Poured millions into the city museum, got his name on a wing. He was ruthless in business and in his collecting. His name was Cassian Reed. The name hit Elias like a physical impact. Cassian Reed, founder and CEO of Lycosys, a global tech conglomerate whose software ran on nearly every computer in the world, a titan of industry, a visionary and famously reclusive, a man whose public persona was a carefully crafted image of detached, benevolent genius. He had a wife, a family who were society fixtures, a corporate empire built on predicting the future. He was a man who had clearly buried his past with ruthless, systematic efficiency. Elias spent the next 48 hours in a feverish digital excavation. He retreated to his study, the one place he still felt in control, and used his archival skills to dig into Reed's life. He wasn't hacking. He was researching, with a single-minded intensity he usually reserved for 18th century land grants. He cross-referenced news articles, society pages from 21 years ago, and old financial reports from Lycosys' early days. He found articles about Reed's early philanthropic efforts, his founding of the Reed Foundation for Contemporary Art. And then he found it, a photo from the society pages of the Chronicle, dated from the very week of the gala Lena had mentioned in her journal. There was Cassian Reed, a younger, leaner version of the man on the cover of business magazines, but with the same cold, appraising eyes. He was shaking hands with the museum director, a faint predatory smile on his lips. He was a shark gliding through a world of beautiful, unsuspecting fish. Getting to a man like Reed would be impossible through conventional channels. He was insulated by layers of security, publicists and lawyers who existed solely to make problems disappear. An appeal to his humanity felt futile. A man who could walk away from a child for 20 years didn't have humanity. He had priorities and a bottom line. Elias looked at Lena's journal lying on his desk. It wasn't just a confession. It was a primary source document. It was leverage. He found his way in, not through a frontal assault, but through a side door, using the tools of his own trade. The Reed Foundation was currently funding a major project to digitize historical city records, a project Elias's own institution had bid on and lost. He used his professional credentials and official title to send a carefully worded email to Reed's executive office. He requested a brief, urgent meeting about a time-sensitive archival discovery of mutual and significant interest, hinting at materials related to Reed's earliest philanthropic endeavors and their complex personal provenances. It was a long shot, a desperate gambit cloaked in academic language. For 2 days, there was only silence. He haunted the hospital, watching Zoe's numbers fluctuate, his hope dwindling with each passing hour. He was about to lose hope when a reply came, terse and efficient. Mr. Reed's executive assistant, a woman named Alistair, would grant him 15 minutes at the Lycus's Tower the next day. The Lycus's Tower was a monument of smoked glass and polished steel that pierced the clouds, a modern-day fortress of Babel. The lobby was a cavern of white marble, hushed and intimidating, designed to make visitors feel small. After passing through a security check that was more rigorous than airport screening, Elias was escorted by a silent guard to a private elevator that shot silently upwards, his ears popping. Cassian Reed's office was on the top floor, a space so vast and minimalist it felt less like an office and more like a conceptual art installation about power. One entire wall was a sheet of glass, offering an absolute godlike view of the city spread out below. Cassian Reed, now in his late 60s, sat behind a desk that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of polished black stone. He was immaculate, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his suit tailored with surgical precision. He did not stand when Elias was shown in. He simply watched him approach with an unnerving reptilian stillness. "Mr. Vance," Reed said, his voice a low resonant hum, a voice accustomed to absolute obedience. "My assistant said this was urgent. You have 15 minutes. Please don't waste them." Elias's heart hammered against his ribs, but his voice when he spoke was steady. He channeled the calm of the archivist, the dispassionate presenter of facts. 21 years ago, you attended the Autumn Patrons Gala at the Museum of Modern Art. You met a young painter there. Her name was Lena. Reed's expression did not change, but a flicker, a subtle tightening around his eyes, a microscopic shift in his posture betrayed him. He had the face of a man who hadn't been genuinely surprised in decades, and he was displeased by the sensation. "I meet many people, Mr. Vance. I have been a patron of the arts for a long time. The names tend to blur. You bought her entire collection," Elias pressed on, his voice flat and factual. "You started a brief, intense affair with her. It lasted one night, in a hotel suite at the Pierre, overlooking the park. She became pregnant." Reed leaned back in his chair, a deliberate theatrical movement designed to convey bored indifference, but his stillness was now the coiled stillness of a predator. "This is a fascinating piece of fiction. Are you a writer, Mr. Vance, or merely a common blackmailer?" "I'm a father," Elias said, the words raw, stripped of any pretense. "The man who raised her. Her name is Zoe. She's 20 years old, and she is currently dying in the University Medical Center. She was in an accident. She has Rh null blood, with a rare K-mod variant. It's one of the rarest genetic markers on the planet. I'm told it's hereditary." For the first time, a genuine emotion broke through Reed's placid surface. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't remorse. It was annoyance. Pure, undiluted annoyance. He looked at Elias as if he were a software bug, a persistent error that had inexplicably appeared in his perfectly coded world. "And what is it you want?" Reed asked, his voice laced with the weary contempt of a man for whom all problems could be solved with money. "Is that the end game here? A payday? To be compensated for a secret you think you've uncovered? Very well. Name your price. My family office will arrange a wire transfer. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement so comprehensive you won't be able to say the word art without violating it, and then you will disappear from my life. The casual cruelty of it, the cold transactionality, the assumption that a child's life was a simple line item in a budget ignited a cold hard fire in Elias's chest. He reached into his worn leather briefcase and placed Lena's journal on the vast, empty surface of the black stone desk. The small worn book looked like a fragile artifact from another world. I don't want your money, Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. I want your blood. You will come to the hospital. You will present yourself as an anonymous donor, and you will save her life. Reed glanced at the journal, then back at Elias. A slow, cruel smile touched his lips. He thought he had the measure of the man before him. You have nothing. A dead woman's diary filled with romantic delusions and unprovable claims. It's meaningless. My lawyers would eviscerate you. They would paint you as a grieving, delusional man attempting to extort a public figure. They would exhume your wife's memory and shred it in a courtroom. Is that what you want? Now, take your little book and get out of my building before I have you removed for trespassing. It's not just a diary, Elias said, not moving, his feet rooted to the floor. It's a primary source. It's filled with details only the two of you would know. Dates, locations, specific conversations. Details that I'm sure your wife of 40 years, your two sons, and the board of directors of this company would find compelling. This isn't a story about an affair. It's the origin story of your firstborn child, a child you abandoned. How does that fit into the carefully curated legacy of Cassian Reed, the benevolent visionary? Reed's composure finally shattered. He stood up with a sudden, violent motion, his hands flat on the desk, leaning forward like an animal about to spring. His face was a mask of pure fury. You think you can threaten me? You, a pathetic little man who files papers for a living? I'm not threatening you, Elias corrected him, his voice still unnervingly calm. I'm presenting you with a verifiable fact and a choice. Your reputation or your daughter's life. You have until the end of the day to make it. Reed stared at him, his brilliant mind clearly calculating angles, threats, vulnerabilities, running through 1,000 permutations. Then, the rage in his eyes was replaced by something else, something that looked like grim, bitter, triumphant victory. He straightened up, a look of profound, malicious pity on his face. There is a flaw in your plan, Mr. Vance, Reed said, his voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. A rather significant, tragic flaw. Even if I were inclined to entertain this absurd fantasy, which I am not, I couldn't help you. I am not a suitable donor for anyone. For the last 5 years, I have been living with chronic myeloid leukemia. My blood is poison. It is a soup of defective cells that would kill your daughter faster than her injuries. So you see, your grand dramatic gesture is pointless. The girl, Zoe, will die. And there is nothing you, or I, or your pathetic little diary can do about it. The word struck Elias with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and the strength from his legs. A dead end. The ultimate cosmic cruelty. He had followed the thread, found the truth, confronted the monster, only to be met with this final, insurmountable wall. Despair, absolute and suffocating, washed over him. He had failed. Lena had failed. The universe had failed. He stumbled back to his car, his mind a black hole of negation. He sat in the driver's seat in the cavernous, silent parking garage of the Lycosis Tower, the engine off, as the city lights began to glitter around him. Leukemia. The man's blood was poison. It was over. He rested his forehead against the cold steering wheel, the image of Zoe, pale and still in her hospital bed, searing his mind. Her life was measured in hours, and he had wasted them. Then another thought. A desperate, grasping tendril of an idea pierced through the fog of his despair. Reed's own words, thrown at him like daggers. His wife of 40 years. His two sons. Elias's fingers, trembling with a renewed frantic energy, flew across the screen of his phone. He wasn't a hacker, but he was a master researcher. He knew how to navigate the deep archives of the internet, the places where information, once posted, never truly died. He wasn't just looking for names. He was looking for a miracle. He found what he was looking for in a cached version of a university alumni newsletter from the previous year. Tristan Reed, Cassian's eldest son, 26 years old, an executive VP at Lycosis. The newsletter featured an article on a public health initiative he had sponsored for company employees. The initiative had included a staff blood drive. The article, meant as a piece of corporate PR, proudly listed his blood type to encourage others, celebrating his donation. Null. It was the longest of shots. A genetic lottery. For a child to inherit such a rare recessive trait, both parents must carry the gene. Cassian had it. His wife, a woman from a family with a history of rare blood disorders, must have been a carrier. And they had passed the impossible combination on to their son. It was the only shot he had left. He didn't call. He didn't email. A formal request would be buried by the same lawyers and assistants that protected Cassian. He drove to the Reed family's palatial estate in the wealthy suburbs, a place of manicured lawns, high stone walls, and wrought iron gates. He didn't try to get past the gate. He just parked his modest sedan across the street and waited, a silent sentinel. Hours passed. The sky turned from bruised twilight to inky black. Finally, close to midnight, the headlights of a sleek silver sports car cut through the darkness, approaching the gate. Elias got out of his own car and stood in the path of the headlights, a lone, desperate figure in the night. The car stopped. Tristan Reed, young and handsome, with a softer, more open version of his father's face, got out, his phone already in his hand, his expression a mixture of annoyance and alarm, ready to call security. "Who the hell are you?" Tristan demanded, his voice sharp. "What do you want?" "My name is Elias Vance," Elias said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and desperation. "Your father and I spoke today about a woman named Lena, about your sister." The confusion on Tristan's face was total, unfeigned. "I don't have a sister." "Her name is Zoe," Elias said, taking a step forward into the glare of the lights, holding his hands up to show he was no threat. "And she's dying. Tonight. She needs you." He explained everything, right there on the quiet suburban street, the whole sordid, tragic story spilling out of him in a torrent. He told him about Lena, the painter, about the hospital, the scaffolding, the desperate search, about the golden blood. He told him about Cassian Reed's confession and his illness. He left nothing out, laying the entire ugly truth at the young man's feet. Tristan listened, his initial aggression turning to stunned, horrified silence. His face paled in the harsh light of his own car's headlamps. "My father." "He knew about this," Tristan whispered, his voice shaking, the words barely audible. "He knew he had a daughter." "He knows," Elias confirmed, his voice flat. "He can't help her. His blood is useless. But you can. You were at a blood drive last year. You have the same blood type. You are her only chance. Her only chance in the entire world." Tristan looked poleaxed. His entire world, his understanding of his family, of his father, reconfigured in the space of 5 minutes. He looked from Elias's desperate, haggard face towards the imposing, brightly lit house where his father sat with his secrets and his poisoned blood. "This is insane," Tristan breathed, running a hand through his hair. Why would he never say anything? My whole life." "Because he's your father," Elias said, the words tasting like ash, "and that's who he is. Now you have a choice to make. You can go inside that house and be his son, or you can come with me and be your brother." Elias stepped back, out of the headlights, leaving the space open. He had done all he could. He had followed the thread to its very end. The rest was up to the conscience of a young man he had just met, a man who had been handed a legacy of lies. He watched as Tristan stood frozen for a long moment, a silent, terrible war playing out across his features. He saw the flicker of denial, the flash of anger, the shadow of fear. Then, with a look of grim, sudden resolution, Tristan pulled out his phone, but he didn't call security. He made another call, his voice firm, changed, aged by the knowledge he now possessed. "Clear my morning schedule," Tristan said into the phone, his voice sharp and authoritative. "And get me the chief of staff at University Medical Center, Dr. Evans. Tell him Tristan Reed is on his way. Tell him it's a Code Omega emergency donation. He'll know what it means." Elias didn't go back to the waiting room. He couldn't face the sterile hope, the questions from the nurses, the possibility of another failure. He went to Zoe's room in the ICU. He gowned up and slipped inside. She was still, so still, but her monitor seemed steadier, the frantic lines less erratic. A new bag of dark, precious blood that was not his, was hanging on the IV pole, a slow, steady drip of life flowing into her veins. He pulled a chair to her bedside. He took her hand, its familiar shape cool, but no longer frighteningly cold in his own. It didn't matter whose DNA she carried. It didn't matter what secrets her mother had kept or what monster had fathered her. He had changed her diapers. He had taught her to ride a bike. He had held her when she cried over her first heartbreak. He had read her to sleep every night for 10 years. He had built an archive of 2 decades of shared moments, of laughter and tears, of inside jokes and quiet understanding. Biology was a footnote, a technicality. Love was the primary source. He was her father. That was the only truth that mattered. An hour later, as the first hint of dawn began to gray the sky, there was a soft knock on the door. Tristan Reed stood in the doorway, looking awkward and out of place in his expensive, now rumpled suit. His sleeve was rolled up, and a small white bandage was taped into the crook of his elbow. Their eyes met over Zoe's sleeping form. There were no words to be said. There was no gratitude to be offered, no anger to be vented. There was just a shared, silent acknowledgement of the strange, broken, and resilient new reality that now connected them all. A brief, almost imperceptible nod, a flicker of understanding. Then Tristan was gone. Elias sat in the quiet room, the rhythmic, steady beep of the heart monitor, a gentle percussion, a song of survival. He looked at Zoe's face. A face he now understood was a mosaic of Lena's beautiful, troubled features, and the features of a man she barely knew. But she was alive. The storm had passed. The history of their lives had been violently rewritten, the new text messy and painful, and stained with secrets. But the future, her future, was once again a blank page. And he, Elias Vance, her father, would be there to help her write it, no matter how complicated the story became.